I never thought I'd find myself in the midst of a situation so outrageous that it would end up becoming something straight out of a poorly written movie script. But life has a funny way of throwing curveballs that can feel surreal. My name is Jamal, and I'm a proud father to an incredible daughter named Zuri. Zuri is an exceptionally bright 12-year-old who happens to be physically disabled due to a rare condition she was born with. She has a wheelchair, a big heart, and a spirit that could light up a dark room. Living in a suburban neighborhood has its pros and cons, and one of the most glaring issues we faced was our local homeowners association, HOA. The HOA president, Mrs. Silas, was a notorious figure in our community. She was known for being overly controlling, but what I didn't realize was just how deeply her racism ran. Things escalated quickly when she decided to take her control over the neighborhood to a disturbing level. Being a single father and part-time blogger, I spent a lot of time at home with Zuri. With her disability, I became her primary caregiver, ensuring she had everything she needed while still trying to provide as normal an upbringing as possible. I embraced every challenge we faced together, and I took a lot of pride in being her dad. But things took a dark turn when I began receiving complaints from the HOA about my front yard. Apparently, the wheelchair ramp I had built for Zuri without the HOA's consent was deemed a nuisance, and Mrs. Silas didn't miss a beat when it came to reprimanding me. Little did she know I had an ace up my sleeve. One fateful afternoon, I came home to find Zuri in tears. She was visibly shaken and had been waiting for me to return from the grocery store, where I had only been gone for an hour and a half. I knelt beside her, hugging her tightly, asking her what had happened. She told me that Mrs. Silas had come by demanding to see her wheelchair contraption, as if it were some kind of contraband. She said I was making the neighborhood look bad, Daddy, her voice quivered. I felt my blood boil. How could someone be so cruel to a child? It didn't stop there. Zuri told me that Mrs. Silas insisted the ramp be disputed, in front of the other neighborhood kids as a lesson. Then came the part that made my heart drop. Mrs. Silas had physically restrained Zuri, chaining her wheelchair to a nearby tree. She literally left my disabled daughter chained in our front yard for all to see, telling her it was a community service, for ruining the aesthetics of the neighborhood. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I raced outside, an angry storm brewing inside me. As I approached, I spotted Mrs. Silas cleaning her gardening tools, acting like she hadn't just committed an atrocity. "Unchain my daughter. Now," I demanded. She chuckled dismissively and replied, "Maybe it'll teach her some manners." Her face was filled with arrogance, and I felt the rational part of my brain slip away. I whipped out my phone, recording everything. "You will regret this," I told her, my voice trembling with rage. Thankfully, just as I was about to confront her further, I noticed a familiar car parked across the street. My brother, Malik, a special agent with the FBI, had been watching the entire ordeal unfold. Malik had always been protective over me and Zuri, keeping an undercover eye on the neighborhood after learning about the complaints and discrimination we'd faced. He'd seen how Mrs. Silas treated us and had made it his mission to protect Zuri. As soon as he caught a glimpse of me confronting her, he got out of the car. "What's going on?" he asked, his expression shifting from confusion to anger as I filled him in. In our family, we believe in taking action, and Malik's cooperation didn't disappoint. He phoned his team while I documented Mrs. Silas's actions. As Malik spoke to his colleagues, I could see fear wash over Mrs. Silas's face when she saw that we weren't just going to let this slide. She had been targeting us, thinking she could get away with her intimidation tactics. Little did she know, she had just crossed a line she couldn't come back from. Before Malik's peers could arrive, he confronted Mrs. Silas himself, calling her out on her illegal actions. "You can't just treat people like this, especially a child," he argued, his voice booming with the authority that came from his badge. Mrs. Silas's bravado crumbled as she realized that she wasn't just dealing with a distressed father but also an FBI agent who was very much aware of her racist tactic. Malik informed her she was being investigated for discrimination and abuse against a minor. The look on her face was priceless. The color drained from her skin, and it was clear her hold over the us was about to end. When the police arrived moments later, Malik presented all the evidence we had gathered, my recording of Mrs. Silas's vile treatment of Zuri, along with witnesses from neighboring houses who had seen it all. As the officers began to question her, Malik stepped aside to speak to me. "Jamal, this isn't going to be easy, but we have to take it to court. Discrimination cases are tricky, especially in neighborhoods like this. But I promise you, they will be held accountable." Mrs. Silas was charged with assault and endangerment. The fallout from the incident spread like wildfire throughout the neighborhood. Other families began to rally around us, realizing just how oppressive the HOA had been, especially towards families of color. While Zuri was shaken up, she also felt empowered by the attention her situation had garnered. With Malik's help, we started looking for a lawyer and built a strong case against the HOA. We weren't just fighting for ourselves anymore, we were standing up for every innocent child who had faced mistreatment in our community. Days turned into weeks, and the build-up to the court date had our family on edge. Malik made sure to involve several advocacy groups, pushing to get more media coverage on our case. Zuri was nervous but also found comfort in knowing that her uncle was there for moral support. He even committed to bringing her to ice cream afterward, a small treat for what lay ahead. The courtroom was packed on the day of the trial. When Mrs. Silas took the podium, it was clear that her arrogance had not diminished. She claimed that Zuri had been a nuisance, and that her actions were simply in the interest of preserving the neighborhood's heritage. The judge's eyebrow raised in disbelief as the courtroom erupted in laughter at her ludicrous claims. As our attorney presented evidence of her discriminatory behavior, showing witnesses who spoke about the unjust treatment other families had faced, Malik stepped forward to give his testimony. "Mrs. Silas abused her position in the HOA," he stated firmly. "This is not just a case about a child. It's a case about a culture of discrimination that has frowned upon people who are different." With each piece of evidence laid out, I felt more and more hopeful. The pressures of the courtroom exchanged the roles between defendant and victim. I saw Mrs. Silas start to crack as witnesses continued to speak up about their negative experiences with her. Finally, after hours of testimonies and deliberations, the moment we had all been waiting for arrived. The judge returned with her verdict. "It is my decision that Mrs. Silas's actions were indeed not only reckless but malicious, targeting individuals based on race and disability. She will be charged with child endangerment and fined by the HOA." Cheers erupted from within the courtroom. I felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude wash over me. "We did it!" Zuri clapped her hands, her face lighting up with joy. It wasn't just a victory for us, it was a triumph for everyone who had suffered at the hands of the HOA. Life took a turn for the better after the trial. The community began to change. With strengthened laws against discrimination, the HOA underwent significant restructuring, and their discriminatory policies were dismantled. Mrs. Silas was ousted from her position, and many families that had been living under her oppressive rule felt a newfound sense of freedom. Zuri and I embraced this new chapter of our lives. Regular community events were organized to better our neighborhood, and Zuri became a celebrated figure, inspiring others with her resilience. People began to view her not just for her disability but for the strength and character she had shown during this ordeal. Malik often reminded us that we didn't just win, it was our stand against an oppressive system that truly broke down barriers. We were living proof that love and family could triumph over hatred and ignorance. Though the pain of the past lingered, it no longer held power over us. We were rebuilding together, stronger than ever. And as I watched Zuri thrive amid all the celebrations, I couldn't help but feel grateful for the path we had taken. We weren't just survivors, we were making the world a better place, one courageous step at a time.